Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Caden Proctor and some of the craziness going on with his recruitment and especially his transfer portal movement. It has been quite the ride in the last couple of days. But let's jump into the Pac-2 teams and all of the craziness happening there. Actually, before we do that, I apologize. I do want to remind you all that we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to see your questions on the screen or your comments on the screen, and we could have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. Is a great way for you all to see your question on the screen, and also obviously for us here at the network to keep doing what we do. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. Let's jump in. We have tons of stuff happening around college football playoff, and a lot of stuff has been cut, I guess, is the best way to put it, from this sport. A lot of different things have been skewed one direction, and that direction has always been in the Big Ten and SEC's direction. They have been kind of monopolizing the sport and slowly gaining more power. And the best way that we have seen that kind of play out in real time has been the college football playoff discussions that have happened recently. Obviously, we just had some revenue agreements that just were just agreed to by pretty much everyone in the nation, and in the FBS especially was the really important part of all of this. And it came down to the SEC and the Big Ten getting 29% each of the college football playoff revenue going forward. So a huge chunk of the pie, at least 50% going to those two conferences, and that is insane. It shows where the sport is at. It shows the power that these two conferences and those two people, and Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, hold in these conversations. And one of the big worries was obviously the ACC and the Big 12 comparative to them, and they did okay. Obviously not necessarily what they wanted, but again, kind of had to fall in line in this type of discussion where two people hold so much power. So the ACC ended up with about 17% of the cut, and then the Big 12 ended up with, I think, 14.5 to 15%. So obviously not nearly as much as the 29 that the SEC and the Big 10 will be taking home, but much more than two of their friends over on the West Coast, because as we know, the Pac-12 has pretty much dissolved before our eyes very quickly. We have 4 schools going to the Big 10, we have 4 schools going to the Big 12, and then we have 2 schools going to the ACC. So tons of things happening in the Pac-12 offices. Obviously, a new commissioner recently that just took over. A lot of things happening. But right now, it's just Oregon State and Washington State sitting out there kind of alone in their Pac-2, as we'll call it for the time being. And there was real worry about what payout that they were going to get, because in the grand scheme of things, they don't hold a lot of weight in the future of college football, especially with the upcoming playoff and all of the new discussions. There's not much of a leg to stand on when you only have 2 teams and you're kind of sitting out there and aren't necessarily even a viable conference when we talk about getting an automatic bid to the playoff. They don't even qualify for that exemption or that requirement for that position. So obviously they did not hold a lot of power in these discussions, but they were able to get a little something out of it. So it looked like for a time that they were going to get about $350,000 a year from the playoff. And obviously that is not nearly as much money as the other schools were getting. I believe the SEC schools were sitting somewhere around $21 million a year. It's quite the gap. There's no two ways about that. But it seems like an amendment has been added to the agreement that is going to get them to make $3.6 million a year until at least 2028. So obviously a huge change in the overall number that they're making, a huge change in the way that these discussions went over the last couple of days. And for the Pac-2, you got to feel great. I mean, it's something that I think all of their fans I know, but I'm sure there were a lot more people, including myself, around the country that really wanted to see these schools as a part of the future of college football, as a big part of it. So I think seeing them at the very least get what I'm calling a life raft for the time being, getting the ability to find where they stand essentially in 2024 and what the best way forward is huge. Being able to at least bring in a little bit of money. You're obviously not going to bring in nearly as much as the Big 12 or the ACC or the SEC and Big 10. That's kind of out of the question at this point, but you can be in the conversation, right? You can at least get yourself a certain chunk of change, be able to take part in these discussions going forward, be a real viable team when coming into these discussions, be a viable product when coming into these discussions, because we've talked about it a lot. The ACC is starting to kind of struggle, and Florida State and Clemson now are suing them, and the ACC just countersued Clemson, which we'll get into tomorrow, and I will break down what tomorrow's show has in store for us a little bit later. But the ACC essentially is floundering a little bit, and they're starting, in my opinion, to look for what the fix is, or at least what the aftermath of all of the changes that are coming looks like for them. And I think one of the biggest things is, how are they going to probably backload that conference? I think once Florida State and Clemson figure out their lawsuits, or even maybe before that, we'll have Miami and North Carolina jump into the fray, and then it's just a matter of time until Virginia and North Carolina State and Louisville and Georgia Tech. So this is a very slippery slope that the ACC is heading down, and there are tons of different candidates around the country that could be backfilled into that conference if need be. So obviously a couple of the choices right around their neck of the woods is a ton of Sun Belt schools. Mainly the two that I pointed out are App State and Troy, because they've been big-time players. JMU just joined and would be a great addition. So there are tons right around their neck of the woods, and Oregon State and Washington State are now in a competition with those teams, kind of. They're in a position where they don't really have the ability to garner a lot of power in these discussions. They don't necessarily have the ability to offer a ton of teams and have them immediately accept, because they're not a big conference. They don't have a ton of money coming in. They don't have a ton of viability as a big-time conference right now. So they're essentially fighting for positions in other conferences, or at least fighting for a little bit more power this upcoming season and into 2025. So I think these next 2 years or then these next couple of years going into 2028, but especially these next 2 or even 3 years, as the ACC starts to see kind of the effects of all of these cases and everything, and they possibly start to lose some teams, they need replacements, and Oregon State is now battling essentially the App States and the Troys of the world for those positions. And it's going to be huge how these teams perform in these next couple of years, and interesting how, the entire athletic department performs. But as we all know, football is, the straw that stirs the drink around at pretty much every athletic department. So when you talk about the football programs, both these teams are really up against it. And they do have leading guys that I tend to believe in. Oregon State elevated Trent Bray from the DC role after Jonathan Smith, it evaded my mind there for a second, but Jonathan Smith moved on to Michigan State. They kept a guy that is familiar with what they do around there, familiar with the university, cares about the university, which is a huge part of this, because there's a lot of uncertainty around there. So you need a person that is in there that loves the school, that loves the kids, and wants to be there, because it'd be very easy to find another job, especially if you're someone like Trent Bray, who just got a head coaching job. He could have followed Jonathan Smith to Michigan State with no problem, I assume. So obviously a huge decision by Oregon State. He needs to get it rolling pretty quickly. They play Oregon, Purdue, and Cal this upcoming year. So obviously some big games. They do have Washington State at the end of the year in that conference game that they will play. But this team and these two teams really, Jake Dickert, the head coach of Washington State, has been there for quite some time. So two guys that are familiar with their programs, familiar with their schools. Washington State is up against it as well next year. They play Washington, obviously, Texas Tech, and Boise State on their schedule. So it's going to be really tough. There's definitely no layups in these next couple of years, but there are some Mountain West teams on the schedule for these two schools, and that's where they need to absolutely clean up. They need to show that they are still above the crop of the next level, right? If you lose to Oregon, if you lose to Purdue, if you lose to Cal, as Oregon State, not ideal necessarily. You'd love to beat Purdue. You'd love to beat Cal, obviously, because they are one of the teams that was taken over you in some of this realignment stuff. So you'd love to get those wins. But at the end of the day, you just need to show there's still a gap between you, a quote-unquote Power 5 team, and the group of 5 teams. You still need to show that you can beat up on Mountain West teams week in and week out. The same thing with Washington State. They need to show that they are one of the most viable options for conference expansion still out there for the ACC, or even possibly if they play well enough and start to garner enough respect, maybe they can add some Mountain West teams to the Pac-12 and keep that rolling as a probably, a second-tier conference, but at the end of the day, stay alive in all of this craziness, and that's kind of the ultimate goal for Oregon State and Washington State right now. So obviously, there is a lot of things that will be happening with these schools over the next couple of years. They have until 2028 before all of that money kind of starts to dry up. And obviously, $3.6 million compared to 21 in the SEC and the Big Ten is a little bit different. It's going to be obviously a little bit tougher to make ends meet around there. But at the end of the day, it's about keeping your head above water. It's about keeping yourself above the group of 5 teams, and hopefully in the next, 6 months to a year, the ACC comes calling and you can walk into another conference and actually have a little bit of stability. Not to say that the ACC is going to be, a big-time conference going forward, but right now Oregon State and Washington State are kind of just sitting out on an iceberg alone, and at the very least they need to get to some land and at least be with a group of people and with a group of teams, because it's a real dangerous position that they're in right now, and if they're not careful over the next couple of years, it's a position they could be in for a really long time and possibly even cause some really, really tough decisions to be made around there. So hopefully that doesn't have to happen. I really hope it does not, and I hope that they can have a great 2 years or a great couple of years. The ACC comes calling, they can join in, or they can make the Pac-12 whole again with some Mountain West teams, because I think that would be a really, really fun conference. And although it wouldn't be at the front of the table, it would have a seat at the table, and that's kind of the ultimate goal for these two schools right now. So obviously a lot more to happen there. We will definitely keep you updated on all of the stuff happening around the Pac-12 teams, because it's kind of a confusing point of our sport right now, especially for those two teams. So we'll keep you updated on everything there, but for the time being, we're going to take our second break, and when we come back, we're going to do breakout players for 2024 on the defensive side of the ball. We've done 2 of these already, so definitely go check out those on the YouTube page, but it's time for part 3, because there are so many guys that are set to break out or step into big shoes this upcoming year, so stick with us, and we will be right back with that.